Today, we're talking about the silent killer of empires, the economic collapse pattern that repeats with the precision of a Swiss watch. It's a 7-stage breakdown, and once an empire starts down the path, the ending is inevitable. To understand how an empire falls, you first have to understand how an empire works. An empire, at its core, is a massive, complicated credit network. It's not just a collection of armies and land, it's a universal system of trust. The Romans didn't conquer the world with swords alone, they did it with a coin. The Spanish didn't control the 7 seas with galleons alone. They did it with a universally trusted silver piece. The secret ingredient in all this is what we call sound money. Think of sound money as the physical representation of the empire's promise. When Rome created the denarius, they were saying, this coin contains exactly 4.5 grams of pure silver. We, the mightiest power on earth, promise you that. You can trust it. That promise wasn't just a financial tool, it was a geopolitical weapon. A soldier in Britain, a merchant in Egypt, a farmer in Gaul, they all accepted the denarius because they knew exactly what they were getting. Real value. This purity of coinage is what allowed Rome to do all the fancy things we remember. Build aqueducts, pave roads, pay legions, and finance expansion. It created stability, which fueled trade, which fueled taxes, which funded more legions. It was a glorious, self-reinforcing circle of power. The same applies to Spain centuries later. When they discovered the legendary Cerro Rico, the rich hill of Potosi in Bolivia, they gained access to nearly half the world's silver supply. They minted the famous Spanish dollar, the piece of 8, a coin so reliable and pure that it was literally the global currency for over 200 years. It was the backbone of trade from Manila to Madrid, a physical, tangible representation of Spain's unassailable wealth and power. In both cases, Rome and Spain, the empire was at its apex. They had military might, technological superiority, and cultural dominance. But the true engine of their power wasn't the army, it was the trust in their currency. This brings us to the moment the pattern begins. Because every single empire, intoxicated by its own success, eventually forgets that the trust they worked so hard to build is fragile. They forget that the economic laws of the universe apply to them too. And they eventually commit the ultimate act of financial hubris. They cheat. Main conflict, the great temptation. The turning point in every great empire's history is not a military defeat. It's a simple realization in the emperor's palace: we are spending more than we have. This is the great temptation, the fiscal apple in the Garden of Eden. Empire is expensive. Maintaining those aqueducts, paying those legions, funding those endless, glorious wars, administering those far-flung colonies, the bill is always astronomical. And as an empire gets older, it becomes bloated. It promises more to its citizens, bread and circuses, it has more bureaucrats, and its defensive perimeter gets longer and more complex. The costs become structural. They are no longer temporary, they are permanent. Now, a healthy, fiscally responsible state has 3 choices: cut spending, raise taxes, or find a new source of wealth. The powerful, arrogant empire, convinced of its own exceptionalism, finds a hidden 4th option, one that seems like pure magic at the time: change the definition of money. This is the moment of fiscal original sign, where the financial foundation shifts from resource-backed silver to fiat backed by nothing but a government's promise. Case study I, Rome, the silent suicide, the debasement spiral. In Rome, the turning point was subtle, insidious, and silver-plated. The Roman emperors couldn't just print paper money. They had to physically tamper with the coins. When Emperor Nero needed to fund his lavish lifestyle and his never-ending wars, he couldn't bring himself to cut the spending or face the citizens with a tax hike. So, he made a decision that sounds like a tiny change, but was actually a financial tremor. He ordered the mints to reduce the silver content of the denarius from 100% to 90%. What an elegant hustle! For every 10 old coins melted down, the emperor now had enough silver to mint 11 new coins. That extra 10% was pure, unearned profit for the state, a magic trick. It was the ancient equivalent of printing money. The problem, of course, is that the emperor did this not because the empire produced more goods or was more productive, but simply because he needed more denarii. More coins chasing the same amount of grain, olive oil, and sandals. That's the definition of inflation. This act of debasement was the moment Rome walked away from its foundational promise of sound money. It set a precedent. Once the door to cheating is opened, it's impossible to close. Every subsequent emperor, facing the same budget pressures and the same temptation, just had to turn the dial further. Key figure: Nero was less a fiscal genius and more a man who needed funds for his eccentric tastes. His motivation was debt and vanity. The climax: death of trust. By the time of the soldier emperor's 3rd century AD, the denarius was down to 50% silver. By the mid-3rd century, it was a wretched, copper slug with a thin, almost apologetic coating of silver. It was 95% worthless metal. The Roman state had officially destroyed its own currency. The climax was the utter failure of the currency to perform its most basic function, facilitating trade. Soldiers refused to fight unless paid in gold or in land, bypassing the government's currency altogether. If his wage couldn't buy him food, why should he fight? Farmers stopped accepting coins and demanded barter goods for goods, shattering the unified market. Tax collectors couldn't collect taxes because a tax paid in debased denarii was worthless to the state. The economic engine of the Western Roman Empire seized up and ground to a halt. It didn't fall to a barbarian horde that punched through the walls. It fell because the legionaries, the very men who defended the walls, just stopped showing up because their paychecks bounced. By 476 AD, when the last Western emperor was deposed, it was less a conquest and more a merciful pulling of the plug on a body that had been financially dead for 2 centuries. The currency died first, and the empire, inevitably, followed. The legacy: the Dark Ages. The immediate aftermath of Rome's collapse was a retreat. Trade ceased, infrastructure crumbled, and knowledge was lost. The legacy of the denarius's death was the literal Dark Ages. Society contracted because the financial lubricant that allowed for scale, specialization, and trade was gone. The pattern proved that once you destroy the medium of trust, the entire civilization built on that trust dissolves into localized, subsistence communities. Case Study 2: Spain, the curse of silver, the paradox of plenty. Centuries later, Spain was sitting on a mountain of wealth that made Rome's treasures look like pocket change. Thanks to the New World conquests, Spain gained access to nearly half the world's silver supply from Potosi. They minted the pure Spanish dollar piece of 8. But then, Spain discovered the great paradox of money. More money does not make you richer if the supply increases faster than the productivity. When Spain flooded Europe with silver, all that happened was that prices rose. What cost 1 silver coin in 1500 cost 10 coins by 1600. The silver wasn't less pure, there was just vastly more of it. This was an inflationary shockwave that rippled across Europe, known as the Price Revolution. And worse, Spain was suffering from the Dutch disease. They were extracting wealth from their colonies and spending it on consumption wars, palaces, luxury imports instead of investment factories, industry. The silver flowed in from the Americas and flowed right back out to England, France, and the Netherlands to pay for the manufactured goods Spain failed to produce itself. Spain became the debt-laden middleman. Key figure: Philip II. Philip II of Spain was perhaps the richest man to ever walk the earth, yet he died poor. His motivation was not vanity, but religious and dynastic commitment. He saw Spain as the armed, Catholic shield of Europe. He was running a global ledger on a medieval mainframe, fighting the Ottoman Empire, the Dutch rebels, and the English simultaneously. His wars consumed the silver faster than the galleons could cross the Atlantic. His catastrophic flaw was in believing that mere quantity of money silver could sustain an empire without productive industry. The climax: the default cascade. Philip's ultimate act was a series of panic defaults. He simply couldn't pay his creditors. He declared sovereign bankruptcy in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, 4 times in 40 years. The richest empire in history, defaulting on its loans because it was addicted to war and had no internal industrial engine. The climax for Spain was the moment its credit rating became worthless. The repeated bankruptcies meant that every sophisticated lender in Europe refused to offer Spain favorable terms. Spain's interest rates skyrocketed. The vast quantities of silver were now merely an accelerating form of inflation, not a source of power. All the silver from Potosi simply flowed out of Spain to service the crippling debt. Spain was left as a massive, silver-rich, but terminally indebted and industrially hollow country. Its climax wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, humiliating, decades-long bleed out of financial credibility, turning the greatest empire into a powerful debtor. The legacy: Wealth without wisdom. Spain's aftermath was a cautionary tale. You can't buy global leadership forever. Its power was supplanted by the industrious, financially savvy Dutch and English. They learned a crucial lesson. Wealth is not the same as productivity. Spain had all the silver, but its rivals had the factories, the trade networks, and the sounder financial institutions. The lessons from Rome and Spain are brutal in their simplicity. Spending is addictive, and debasement is the drug of choice. Whether you physically chip silver out of a denarius, or you flood the market with newly discovered silver, the result is the same. The value of your currency, and the trust in your power, is destroyed. Case Study 3. Britain. The paper promise broken the exorbitant privilege for 2 centuries. The British pound sterling was the foundation of global trade. The secret, the gold standard. The pound was not just a currency. It was a receipt for a fixed, measurable amount of physical gold held in the Bank of England's vaults. Over 60% of global trade was invoiced in pounds. The world chose the pound because they knew, with absolute certainty, what that receipt was worth. The British Empire was built on credit. That credit was backed by the gold standard, allowing Britain to raise vast sums of debt to fund its global factories, its massive navy, and its endless colonial administration. The war debt turning point. The turning point was World War I. To finance the brutal, total war economy, Britain had to borrow astronomically. The national debt skyrocketed tenfold. Critically, the need to print money forced the government to suspend the gold standard in 1914. The pound was temporarily fiat. The financial climax came in 2 distinct moments. Churchill's folly 1925. The key figure here is Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer. Driven by imperial pride, he was determined to restore the pound's dignity. He put Britain back on the gold standard, but at the pre-war exchange rate, a rate that was now wildly overvalued given the nation's war debts and weakened industry. This was a disaster. The overvalued pound made British exports too expensive, crushing domestic industry. Churchill's desire to look strong in the short term guaranteed long-term economic agony. In 1931, Britain was forced off gold permanently. The Bretton Woods handover 1944. After World War II, Britain was utterly exhausted and deeply indebted, its debt reaching 270% of GDP. While the war was still raging, the world's financial elite met at Bretton Woods. They recognized that the British Empire was bankrupt. The US dollar, backed by the world's largest gold reserves, was officially installed as the new primary global reserve currency, replacing the pound sterling. The climax, financial humiliation. The final, humiliating climax came during the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain and France tried to cling to their old imperial power by invading Egypt. The United States, now holding the financial keys, threatened to crash the value of the pound sterling on international markets. Britain was forced to withdraw its troops in utter humiliation. It proved that financial power had fully shifted. Britain could no longer afford to be a great power. The pattern completed in 1976, when, crippled by inflation reaching 25%, the British government went begging to the International Monetary Fund (IMF) for a bailout. The pound, once the undisputed backbone of global trade, was reduced to a supplicant. The empire was officially over, defeated not by a foreign invasion, but by its own balance sheet. The legacy, the handover of the reserve. Britain's aftermath was the controlled, humiliating decline into a secondary power, the best-case scenario of the collapse pattern. The decisive legacy here was the formal transfer of the exorbitant privilege, the right to pay its debts in a currency that only it can print, to the United States. The torch was passed, and the American century began, built atop the vast, fragile financial architecture that Britain had just broken. Case Study 4. The United States. The final stages. The Nixon shock. The United States inherited the greatest financial advantage in history, and for decades, it seemed immune to the pattern. But the same temptations, military overextension, Vietnam, Cold War bases, and social overspending, Great Society programs, led to the same inevitable choice. The key figure in the final undoing of sound money was Richard Nixon. His motivation was political survival. As the U.S. spent more dollars than it had gold, foreign nations, led by France, started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars. The gold was flooding out of Fort Knox. On August 15, 1971, Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window, ending the convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold. He decoupled the U.S. currency from any physical asset, making it pure, unadulterated fiat money. This removed the last guardrail, giving the U.S. government unlimited power to print its way out of any problem, the accelerated debt spiral. With the guardrail gone, the pattern entered an accelerated phase. Deficit spending, trillion-dollar deficits became the norm. The national debt grew from less than $1 trillion in 1980 to over $36 trillion today. This debt is structurally unpayable under current economic terms. Digital debasement. Since 2008, and especially since 2020, the Federal Reserve has engaged in historic levels of quantitative easing money printing, injecting trillions of dollars into the system. This is Nero's trick on a digital scale, but at a speed Nero could never have imagined. Inflation. The massive printing has resulted in the highest sustained inflation in decades, rapidly eroding the purchasing power of the dollar and American savings. The climax. Loss of confidence. This is the stage we are currently entering. For the U.S., the climax will be the moment the world loses confidence and the dollar loses its global reserve status. De-dollarization. Global central banks are shedding dollars and buying gold at record rates. The BRICS nations Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are actively building alternative trade and payment systems to bypass the dollar. They are preparing for the post-dollar era. Military cost. The U.S. continues to maintain the most expensive military footprint in history, funded almost entirely by this ever-growing debt and printed money. Just like Rome's unpaid legions, the cost of the empire is now the very thing that is crippling the home nation. When the soldiers' international trade partners start demanding payment in something other than the government's currency, the pattern is nearing completion. The unforgiving pattern and final reflection. The sober truth is that the U.S. has not only followed the pattern, it has perfected it. The fate of every empire in history is defined by the same 7 stages, a sequence that is economic and absolute. The 7 stages of empire collapse dominance. The empire is at its apex. The currency is backed by something real: silver, gold, or vast, reliable gold reserves. Overextension. The empire expands beyond its means: military bases, endless wars, large social promises. Costs become unsustainable. Deficit spending. The government spends more than it earns. The deficits become structural and permanent. Currency debasement. The empire breaks the promise: Nero shaves silver, Britain abandons gold, U.S. prints fiat money. Inflation. More money chases the same goods. Purchasing power is rapidly eroded. We are here. Loss of confidence. Both domestic citizens and foreign nations lose trust in the currency, seeking alternatives: gold, other currencies, barter. We are entering this stage: collapse. The economic system fails. The empire can no longer fund its military or administer its territories. The global order shifts. The inevitable outcome. The pattern doesn't care about American exceptionalism, or Spanish silver, or Roman legions. It cares about math. You cannot indefinitely fund an overextended global empire with debt that can only be serviced by printing more money. The 3 outcomes. History gives us 3 possible outcomes for the U.S. Controlled decline. The British path. A slow, humiliating loss of reserve currency status, allowing the U.S. to adjust to a second-tier status while maintaining internal stability. Chaotic collapse. The Roman path. The currency is utterly rejected, leading to hyperinflation, political fragmentation, and social breakdown. Financial reset. A desperate, planned restructuring of the debt and the currency into a new system, perhaps a new gold standard, or a basket of world currencies. The most terrifying variable is that when the Roman Denarius collapsed, it only affected the Roman world. When the US dollar collapses, it affects the entire, interconnected globe. The pattern says the end is coming. The debt says we're close. The money printing says we're close. The pattern never lies. If this video gave you a powerful, and slightly terrifying, new perspective on history and the world economy, then you know what to do. Hit that like button right now, and if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the greatest, most dramatic stories our world has ever told. Because history is not a collection of dates and names. It's a collection of patterns, and the pattern never, ever lies. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next epic deep dive. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and always, always remember the lessons of the past.